No, that wasn't good. Anyway, we just go. Hello and welcome to this episode on the CICD on AWS YouTube channel, and I'm glad that I have a good friend of mine on the call today. Anders, welcome. What are we going to talk about today?
Today I'm going to share a story with you where you will learn how to scale to thousands of CI/CD pipeline without adding any more overhead or governance than having hundreds. And this is from a project I'm working with at the Airline Norwegian.
And this is amazing because we actually try to bring real life experiences to this channel. And I need to be frank, I already saw this presentation. I know what we're going to talk about at the AWS Community Day in Germany. And I know that there's a lot of great content in it. But before we go into the details and we get very technical, Anders, if you watch some of my videos, you know there is always this first 20 seconds when I ask people to help me make things in my background a little bit more colorful. And I have 3 stickers for you. I need to pick the next one that is going to be up. I have this one first, which is a AWS hacker sticker. I don't know. I have some pizza. Everyone loves pizza. And then last but not least, for today, I picked community.aws marketing sticker that we got last year, Reinvent. Which one do you want me to put up in the background?
Well, as a community hero, I would sure like the community sticker, of course.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And I'm going to add that later. Otherwise, everything will fall down. That happened twice already. So with that, Anders, who are you? Where are you dialing in from today? And what the hell are you doing for us as a community and in your day-to-day job?
So, yes, I'm Anders Bjørnestam. I'm dialing in from Oslo, Norway. I am an AWS Community Hero and also organizing the user groups in Norway. Main user group for me is in Oslo, but I'm also helping out in 3 other user groups in Norway to coordinate things there. So, and on a daily basis, I'm working as a consultant, only focusing on AWS projects, and I've been doing that since 2010. So a quite good experience on the platform, actually.
Cool, thank you. This is amazing. And I think just keeping the community around in a state in a country like Norway is not that simple, right? Because you're more far apart than you are in Germany, right?
Yeah, it's I need to jump on a plane for 45 minutes to go to Trondheim or Bergen, for example, and also the cities are smaller. So, well, you know that with kind of small user groups already. So, if we're getting 10, 15, 20 people at a meetup, that is great because fewer people to me leads to better discussions and better networking than kind of having 100 people as the audience.
That is true. I have 5 to 10 people at my user group, so I really know the feeling of having small user groups, and that has a lot of benefits as well. Andres, thank you so much for the stuff that you do for the community, but we're not here to talk about community today. We wanted to look a little bit into pipelines, generating pipelines, and what the hell this is. So maybe let's jump into it and directly go into the project that you want to tell us about today.
Yeah, sure. Thanks a lot for having me and doing this presentation. I really like sharing knowledge with the community and with people. I feel sorry if I see people are doing the same mistakes I've been doing for several years. So that's kind of my motivation here. So I try to find the interesting projects I'm working on and see if I can gather some knowledge from them to share with all of you. And also this is based on a project I'm working with at a customer site. So I've managed to get the details I'm able to share here. Of course, we have some more finer details, but we can't share everything, and everything is not relevant for the general audience. So I think we'll kick it off with that as a background. So just since we have an international audience here and not only kind of a European audience, I'm working for Norwegian, and for those of you who's not based in Europe, Norwegian is an airline, Norwegian Airline, based out of Oslo, and have 436 routes this summer 2.8 million people a month as passengers. And as you can see, quite an extensive network in Europe and also a lot of local routes in Norway. So a fairly large company, and we have a lot of systems. So it's not one of these kind of small companies with few IT systems, but a lot of things around. So this is kind of so you know where we're coming from when we're building these things here. So
so, quick question: Norwegian is completely on AWS, or most of it on AWS? What is the approach?
We are migrating to AWS, and I'm also getting back to that in my slides in 2 seconds. But in general, traditionally, of course, running things on-prem, but moving all the workloads and also the analytics side into AWS now. We're not completely there yet. And of course, there are systems we can't run in AWS as well, due to, you see, all things going on at the airport and all other places. So it's complex.
Makes sense.
So I'll go through a bit more on that now, Johannes, on the background and goal. Quickly on the setup and the AWS services I'm going to talk about today. And the main focus now is governance, pipeline structure, and kind of the idea we had when building this. And you can see how it kind of is able to scale. And at the end, I added some lessons learned and next steps, and also added some new things to you, Johannes, since you saw this talk recently, but things are moving fast. So I'm constantly updating things here. So we are running or moving to AWS. We have a huge portfolio of in-house applications, system processes, applications, mainly in Java and .NET. Lots of processes shuffling data around with BizTalk, business objects, and whatnot. I don't have the complete overview here. And also a large number of integration with SaaS vendors and external companies. For example, tons of integration with airports, so you can get your boarding passes in the kiosks, you can get through security, you can get boarded and things like that. And all of these things really have to be up and running all the time with low latency. So we're migrating from on-prem to the cloud for mainly everything. So that's kind of the goal. Applications, fairly easy. Integrations, sometimes easy, sometimes hard. Then we have the data and analytics side, which we're also moving into AWS. And then we also have a principle of SaaS solutions first, then AWS. Typically, if you have an accounting system running in on-prem, and you can get that as a SaaS solution, we're not migrating the accounting system into AWS, of course. So if we can find SaaS solution that fits the workloads, we're doing that, and then it ends up as an integration instead of migrating the application. So pretty standard, I guess, for a lot of companies.
And just quick question on that: you are then in one region, or are you in multiple regions? Because you are kind of fairly local with that stuff.
Yeah, we're based in AWS in Ireland. That's based on, we started this in, as mentioned here, in 2018. So Ireland was pretty up to date and good to go. If it had been today, might have ended in Frankfurt as well, probably, but hard to say. But it had to do with region features back then. So Ireland is the place now because you're focused on Europe, and we also, of course, using content delivery networks and whatnot for users and end users, and all our business is in Europe. So
okay, makes sense.
That's the reason. So the good thing with this company is that they've had a DevOps culture and had a platform team also on-prem. So we kind of had the organizational things already there. So we didn't have to work a lot with people understanding these things and throwing deployments over the fence to other people deploying things and debugging and whatnot. So it's been very, on-prem, the work has been very much the same way as we've done doing in AWS. So you build it, you run it, you crash it, you fix it style. So we started building on AWS in 2018 and moving some workloads, and then we have the data platform. We started with that in 2019, actually, and of course, then we had a pause during the pandemic because the airline industry was not really the industry with a lot of business during the pandemics. Nice thing then was, of course, we had started with a data platform, but we could actually scale that down to almost zero in March 2020. So we could see a huge drop in the bill when the pandemic hit. So we were able to scale down, which we couldn't do on-prem. So that was fairly costly to keep things up and running for a lot of companies. So important to scale up, but also important to scale down if needed, because things might happen. So talking today, I'm going to talk about our AWS setup for the deployments and whatnot. And the context here is that we have 30 plus different AWS accounts, showing a little bit of that later. We're close to 500 CICD pipelines now deploying into those accounts, and that might be infrastructure, it might be applications, it might be things or policies for the data lake and whatnot. And that is across more than 20 teams or 20 different business domains. So we don't have necessarily 25 physical teams, but some people are working with different hats depending on what they're doing because of the life cycle of applications and things like that. So that's the content.
Cool.
Yes, our goal in AWS is automation. So no ClickOps in AWS, and it's been like that from day one. So people have read-only access into AWS. But if we're doing something else, we have to do it in code. So that is Git and pipelines. So we need to have a solid foundation on that.
So does that mean that you really have only read-only access to all of the AWS accounts?
In the users in the console, and CLI and whatnot, yes. There are a few exceptions. Of course, Sandbox are exceptions, but they're kind of satellites here. They're not connected to anything.
Okay.
And we have some exceptions in some accounts where you can, by adding tags, you can give permission, for example, to stop and start a step function, because sometimes in a development environment, you need to be able to do it manually due to missing integrations with vendors in development environment, for example. That's typically that we're working with integrations with vendors, but they don't have any development or QA environment. So then we need to find some ways to do it. But in general, no creation of resources, no deletion of resources, no update of resources manually. I think we're at 99% automation.
Cool.
And the exceptions are the things AWS don't let us do with CloudFormation or APIs.
That is impressive, Anders. I've not seen many organizations be that way ahead.
Thanks a lot. It's a pain in the start, but when we kind of find the way to do it with least privilege in a kind of 80-20 thing, it really works pretty well. Well, you'll see during the presentation now the way we're handling this and how we can manage it.
Cool.
So we're doing all the least privilege access centrally in the platform team, also best practices. And what we also try to do is working in a uniform way across the teams. And we need that to be able to scale and make things easy. And of course, as managed services as possible. So prefer, of course, RDS to ECS with installed databases and all the well-architected things you know. Then more into the focus today for the CICD setup. So developer tools must scale. And I guess all of you and as well Johannes agree on that. It must scale to different account types. So we must be able to use the developer tools both on the network account, on the application accounts, on the data accounts. It must scale to many teams, many different team types. A data engineer and a network engineer is two different things. And then, of course, also support multiple types of workloads and resources. So we need to deploy policies in lake formation, as well as routing tables in the transit gateway. And we've done all of this with code. it needs to have little friction. So for this to work, for people to embrace it, it needs little friction. So it just needs to work. Can't be buggy, can't block you all the time, and things like that. And also some kind of self-service. And when I'm saying self-service here, I'm not talking about a portal with self-service. I'm more talking about blueprints, easy accessible templates, making it very easy for the teams themselves to set up CI/CD pipelines so the platform team don't become a bottleneck. And of course,
that essentially means serving as an enabler for the development teams and application teams is what you're doing. So that really means that I think we're going to see that they all share the same or similar pipelines at the end, right? So
yes.
That's a mandate at the end from the central team.
Yeah, correct.
Has it always been like that at Norwegian?
No.
How did you get there? If you remember.
If you're talking on-prem, what I can say there is, of course, as I said initially, you're developing in Java, you're developing in .NET. That means that on-prem you typically have two different systems for doing builds and deploys. And each team is tweaking things their own way. We've had some central management on that. But basically, I've not been deep into the on-prem stuff, so I'm just trying to take 2 steps away from that and look forward, not backward. So, of course, we have to learn from what's been done. But what I've been doing earlier is it's a very good team, so they've been working very well. But to be able to scale this also to embrace the infrastructure and the data side is the hard part. If it was just the Java developers, .NET developers, it would be pretty easy because they're used to toolings like this. Okay, a data engineer is not necessarily used to doing a Git push.
That is true.
Not all of them. And when you're getting into pull requests and things like that, it's even more kind of magic to a lot of people outside the kind of core developer setting. So, as you said, we are an enabler and also a facilitator. So we're trying to aggregate best practices, but we also want to help taking the discussions between the team when they want to have a pipeline of a certain type. We don't want to have each team define their own kind of way the pipelines work. So we're bringing people together and try to do just a quick kind of pro and con and see is this a good way to do it for all of you, and then we try to do that. And some of the goals there is also for people to be able to switch teams without adapting to new ways of working.
Okay.
So the main building blocks for the CICD tooling we're using CloudFormation. So for the CICD stuff, that is what we're using. No Terraform, no CDK there, and that was basically because we started out with it in that way. And it's the same. It's fairly easy or fairly complex to all parties using that. And also when we're working kind of broad, we didn't want to dive into CDK. Remember also we started in 2018 with this. For developers, the CDK is pretty good. For the data side or for the network side, CDK is not necessarily pretty good because you need to kind of have the development environment available as well. We're using CodePipeline, CodeBuild from AWS, and we're using Atlassian Bitbucket and or AWS CodeCommit, which we soon can just rule out here now, since it's not available to new accounts, new customers, but still it doesn't really matter because everything is just Git. So Atlassian Bitbucket works well for us. Of course, IAM plays a role here. Key management service plays a role here. AWS Lambda plays a role in the way that we're using Lambda to customize some of the pipelines. So if there is features in the pipeline we need, which is not there, we can customize it with some Lambda functions. As always, if you ask AWS for something, they're saying, we don't have it out of the box, but of course you can build it yourself with Lambda functions. And then of course, S3 is always in the picture regardless what you're doing. So that's the building blocks, and that's what we're talking about today. If you're using some other pipeline tooling, whatever, I'm not that familiar with all the details in other toolings, but you might get some ideas on how to structure things today as well. So we might get some takeaways, even though you're not using CloudFormation or CodePipeline to set up your pipelines, I hope.
I'm missing in this list code artifact and ECR for storing artifacts and images. What's your approach to that?
We're using code artifact and we're using ECR. I will show it in some slides here now, but it's building blocks in all the builds here, of course. But kind of this is what these services is what I'm focusing on today in the presentation. So we can dive into ECR and code artifact and all the other cool stuff another time, Johannes. I guess we have a lot of patterns there as well.
Yeah.
So the setup we have is a very standard AWS setup with organizations. So we're using AWS organizations and SSO to give people access to all and everything they need. So regular management account. And we have services accounts, which you can see here on the right. So we have services accounts for DevStage and Prod, and we also have analytics accounts, DevStage and Prod. We have auditing accounts, backup account, networks account. We have shared account with some shared resources, sandboxes, whatever. And then we have 3 CICD accounts as well.
Okay.
And that's where the pipelines are living and deploying to different accounts when we're using this. And everything is set up through CI/CD pipelines. I mentioned we have AWS organization, so we're using Control Tower just to bootstrap the security controls. And then everything else is rolled out with CI/CD pipelines. We're not using Control Tower landing zone or things like that. So we're just using the pipelines to roll out things. Same with SSO, actually, Identity Center in AWS. That is also fully managed with code. So we're not doing any updates in that. So when we're getting new groups in our identity provider, we can just add that in CloudFormation, and access is rolled out where needed as well. So it's quite a powerful setup, I think.
Yeah, it sounds like it. Great.
Then CodePipeline, just mentioning in CodePipeline, we have stages and we have actions. So you have the blue boxes here are the stages. So typically we have source, getting it from code commit or from Bitbucket. We have actions, so we're doing a build. And in the build here, I'm just using build as example when I'm talking, but it could be tests, it could be load testing, it could be security scanning, whatever. But I'm not trying to keep it simple here. It's kind of a bit irrelevant what goes into some of the boxes for the message in this talk. And we have different kinds of actions in the stages. And the important one is that we can do the actions in parallel and we can do them in sequence. And 2 actions we are using a lot is, of course, manual approval. And with manual approval, it means that someone needs to approve going further down the pipeline. But it doesn't have to be manual because everything has an API, so we can actually automate the manual approval if you like. And we've done that typically then with Lambda functions as well. So we're using Lambda functions in the pipeline to tweak the pipeline and to make the automation even smoother. So one example is typically you're deploying something and the deploy might be safe in the way that you can actually check in CloudFormation, you can check the change set and you can see, are you going to update resources? Are you going to delete resources? Are you going to create resources or replace them? And we could have a Lambda function saying that if CloudFormation doesn't have any changes, or if it's only update, the Lambda function will approve the manual step. But if we're seeing that we're going to remove resources, then Lambda could check it and it could say, I want to approve it because it's dangerous. So some human have to look into it. So that's kind of the way we're looking into automation inside the pipelines as well.
Okay, cool.
So
but that somehow means that you're building things around CodePipeline here, right? Because some of the stuff that you want to achieve is not available in CodePipeline, so you need to kind of build some glue around that as well.
Yes, sure.
Okay, makes sense. Yeah.
Always want to tweak something, always something missing, or always something that is not suiting your needs. So if it's easier to create a Lambda function doing that, we'll do it, but we try to fix it with the way it works already.
Yep.
General setup is just a picture of kind of a traditional pipeline. And you've all seen that before many times. You have a build, you have a deploy to development, you have a deploy to stage and deploy to prod. So we're doing one build and we're using the same artifact here. So that's the setup we have in a CICD account. And then we're deploying things into the other account by assuming a role in the other account. So the pipeline needs to assume a role in the dev account to be able to deploy, for example, CloudFormation there or do something there. So that assume role is deployed. That assumed role is a different role for the different pipelines. So what we're mainly doing is each team have their own role when they're deploying. So if the marketing team is deploying something, the pipeline is assuming a marketing role when it's doing deploys. If the aircraft planning team is doing a deploy, they're assuming the aircraft role, the planning role in the other account. In that way, the teams can't kind of deploy things into another team or destroy things for another team. If needed, we could actually have separate role for each pipeline, but we don't have.
Okay, so you have one role for the whole pipeline. How do you then control access to that? Are the pipelines in different accounts, or is this based on IAM permissions at the end?
This is based on IAM. So the pipeline, the deploy step has based on which team is running the deploy step assumes a role in the development account based on tags. And the governance of the roles of the pipelines and the governance of the roles in the account is in a separate repository. Okay, so basically we can lock that down.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
And the roles are, of course, deployed with pipelines all over the place.
That's how it should be.
Yeah.
And the pipelines also kick off automatically after code commit at the end or merge to main.
Pipelines are running automatically based on events from Bitbucket, yes.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Yeah.
So here is what you asked about. ECR is here. I've not taken code artifact in here, but we have ECR, and the ECR repo is living in the CICD account. Mm-hmm. So the artifacts, when you're building something, it goes into ECR, and then the other accounts are allowed to pull the images from ECR based on the repository and based on the owner. So the marketing role is able to pull the ECR repos that marketing is owning, so they can't kind of go cross teams either. So we secured that one as well. And also we have artifacts in S3. Sometimes we just need plain files, which goes into S3. And also the pipelines are using S3 as an artifact store when they're passing the artifacts around. Mm-hmm. And on top of that, we have KMS, mainly to ensure integrity. So things in S3 are encrypted with a key, so we know that who is kind of putting things there. But as it is today, people are not allowed to download. They can download the artifact, but they can't unzip it because it's encrypted. So that's just a side effect, but it's nice to have. But we don't have secrets in the code anyway, so normally not. But that's kind of what you get out of the box.
Now, if you talk about artifacts here, are these immutable artifacts that are built in the build step, or is this other stuff that is part of that?
When you're building in the build step, we're building immutable artifacts which we're deploying around, and the artifact in the S3 bucket is also some are immutable, some are not immutable. So it kind of depends on some of the setup here in the details.
Okay,
but mainly we have a system there as well.
Okay, makes sense.
Goes where. But it's just a nice way to have it. So it's the idea of having the k-means key, having the artifact is also a way of controlling where things are floating around. So it's not laying around in other accounts and we lose control on latest version and whatnot, and you have deployed from the wrong account and things like that.
Makes sense.
This is kind of, the setup is not something we invented. It's from a blog post in AWS in 2017. So that was kind of coming right before we started with this. And I started with it at Norwegian, and I've also used it with other customers. So we've kind of done some investments in my company as well to make kind of a framework way of solving this. So this is the link, and probably Johannes can add that to the transcripts or whatever later, in case you want to look at the blog post. So that's kind of the mother of all the pipelines here. Let's dive into the cool stuff here now on how we're kind of able to make different pipelines. So for the pipelines, we have multiple types. So typically, the example I'm using here is a pipeline deploying CloudFormation or some workload deploys. Could be a SAM deploy, or could be some CDK. We're using CDK as well in some of the teams, but we're not using that on the CICD infrastructure. But of course, we need to deploy it. So a typical pipeline is build, deploy, manual approval, and deploy to prod, as we talked about. But then suddenly someone is saying that, okay, we're not working on master all the time. We're working on a release branch and a develop branch or a feature branch. So we need another type of pipeline where if we get a commit into the develop branch, we're building and deploying to develop. And if we're getting a commit into the release branch, we need to do a build and we need to do a deploy into stage and prod. So this is a variation of the first one. So basically what it says me is that these two are the same. It's just a variation with a switch. So basically it's the same pipeline type with a slight variation. So my thinking then is, how could I build these two pipelines and be smart, so we just have a switch on what kind of pipeline type you're using and reuse all the other code? Because all the components are the same in these two pipelines. So that's the way I'm thinking when we're setting up this. And actually, after we talked last time, this one has evolved with a third pipeline. Okay. So now I also have a pipeline triggering on feature/star.
Okay.
And that pipeline is only doing a build.
Cool. Okay. Cool.
And sending the build status back to Bitbucket.
That makes sense, because then you can actually see what the build results are. You can potentially also integrate unit test results if you want to kind of continue on that. Okay. So how do you implement that switch then at the end? Because CloudFormation is not well known for being dynamic.
It's basically we're using maps, conditions, and if statements.
Okay.
And then I can imagine trying to do that in a smart way, and we're trying to hide it from the developers. But the cool thing was that when I talked to you at the community day, which is not many days ago, then we had this one, and the new one was implemented now recently, and just putting in that feature pipeline as a variant of this one was 15 minutes of work.
Wow. Cool. And then you were able to roll it out to all teams, I guess, in a very short time as well.
So then I could send out a message on Slack saying that if you're just adding a feature branch, a parameter called feature branch, and the feature branch or branches you're using into your pipeline setup, you automatically get that third one.
Cool.
We'll see some examples on that later. Another one we have is we need to deploy the same things to multiple environment accounts. So normally we're not deploying the same service, the same application to two dev accounts, two stage accounts, but we need to deploy the same basic setup when it comes to IAM policies, when it comes to networking, when it comes to all of these basic resources. So basically, instead of running the pipeline twice or 3 times or 30 times deploying things out to all the different accounts, we just created a pipeline which can deploy to all these standard environment accounts, as we're calling it, all the accounts running the workloads, and we're doing the deploys in parallel. So it tries to deploy to dev, and if one of the accounts deployment stops or crashes, then it doesn't continue to stage with any account. So it's kind of fail-safe in that way as well. So that is very similar to the previous one. So actually, it's also exactly the same code with the switch. So we can do this parallel deployment also with the release and develop, and also the feature pipelines as well in one template. Then we have the need to deploy only to one account. So we have one networking account with transit gateway and whatnot. We have one account for backups. We have one account for this, one account for that. So we also need a pipeline just to do a build and deploy to one single account. And that is a separate pipeline type. So it takes an account number and so the same parameters as the rest, and it just deploys to one account and not to all the others. So it's a way to kind of have a very general deploy to different accounts.
Mm-hmm.
We have some pipelines just doing builds because we need to build some applications which we're not deploying immediately. It might be libraries, it might be golden images, things like that. So we have a pipeline just for doing builds, which are pushed to ECR in this case, or we could, of course, put it into code artifact and things like that. Mm-hmm. So that's a one. And again, just saying that again, in the build step here, it might be tests, it might be unit tests, it might be security scanning, whatever. It's up to the teams to some extent to do that, but we also have some standards.
I assume that depends then on the build stack, build task actions that the team is able to configure then as well, right? So they can decide whether it's NPM or Maven or whatever that they will be executing over there.
Sure. And of course, for those of you deep into the AWS code build, you have the build spec YAML file, which describes how your build is done. And that is in the project. So all the teams are owning their own build spec. If they're not supplying a build spec, typically if you're just deploying CloudFormation, because there's a lot of infrastructure, we have a standard build spec which is used if you don't have a build spec in the project.
Makes sense.
And that is also kind of being enhanced all the way. Then, for the fun part, we need to deploy things into the CICD account. So we have all the pipelines running, but the pipelines need to deploy things into the CICD account because when we have ECR and other things, we have policies, and we also have pipelines. So then we have a CICD pipeline type, which is able to deploy into the CICD account itself, because permissions doing that is very different from deploying to the other accounts, and then is another way of thinking because there is no assume role in that way and so on. And it also needs to kind of know about the different pipelines and what is going on. So that is a separate pipeline type here as well. So that's kind of in this presentation, that's some of the pipelines type we have. We have a few others as well, but it's less than 10. So we're trying to keep the number small on different variations. So just a recap, build, deploy into different accounts, and we have some ECRs and S3 laying around here as well. So that was kind of the setup we have. And this setup is used now on almost 500 pipelines.
Wow.
And it's growing fast.
And that means 500 applications, 500 services in total.
No, it means it means a bit fewer because we have, as you remember, some of the pipelines here is setting up multiple pipelines. So some of them are setting up one pipeline for dev and one for stage and prod. So I've just counted the pipelines here.
Okay, makes sense.
So I guess it's fewer. And also some of the pipelines are kind of small. It just deploys, as you know, some infrastructures might just be a pipeline deploying some secrets or parameters. So it's all kind of from the simple ones to bootstrapping the SSO, which takes, or updating the SSO takes, relay information takes 15 minutes just to do all the deploys. So the key thing is here kind of how do we handle this and how do we get to the point we're able to cope with this and do things as fast as I told you. We could just add new features in sometimes in minutes. And we can also, for me, if it's 500 pipelines or 5,000 now with the way we're doing it, it's not a problem for me. We might hit some limits in AWS or some things, quotas we might have to raise, but still, from a governance point of view, it doesn't really matter.
These pipelines all live in the same account, is what you said at the beginning, right?
Three different accounts.
Production, pre-production, and dev, or what?
We have one CICD account for all the application and all the services running.
Okay.
We have one CICD account for all the data and analytics workloads. And we have one CICD account for all the other accounts. So when you're deploying into networking, into the backup, into whatever accounts, that's kind of the corner case account with all the CI/CD pipelines that are not kind of regular pipelines as such.
Okay.
And
interesting. Yeah.
And the split is there basically because we see that the setup for the analytics side and the application side is very different kind of from a human way of things. There is also very little kind of cross use of people across those two parts. So it's easier to focus if you're working on the data analytics side and you're going into the CI/CD account. It's only CI/CD pipelines related to your own area.
Makes sense. One more question on the setup of the pipelines, because you said they are in 3 different accounts and you have like 500. I think one of the code pipeline limits is roughly 300 pipelines that can pull from source. Have you reached that limit in one of the accounts yet, or not yet?
No, we've not reached the limit. We're looking into what limit we can raise and also how we can split this. But to me, I don't think, and as we will see now as we go along, if I split it into more CI/CD accounts, we've discussed if we should have CI/CD pipelines running in dedicated accounts per team. From my point of view, from the platform point of view, it doesn't really matter because everything is automated the same way regardless, which is in the magic sauce coming later.
Okay.
So should we dive into the governance, Jonas?
Yeah, let's look into that. How do you control the governance of the pipelines?
Yeah. So as I said, we have the numbers, and also these things must scale into many teams as we discussed. So we have this multiple pipeline types. So let's say we have a pipeline type for deploy, which is deploying into the different accounts. We have a single account, we have ECR builds, and we have CI/CD deploy. So that is 4 pipeline types. And in our case, that is 4 CloudFormation templates. So all the different deploy variations I had with 1, 2, or 3 pipelines is basically one template. For me, it's just a variation.
Okay.
And all of them is maintained by the platform team. So we have these pipeline types in a CI/CD repository. So again, made it a bit simpler to understand. So it might be details here in repositories and whatnot, but basically templates, one account, ECR build, CI/CD, whatever, used for deploying a pipeline. And typically in CloudFormation, it is a lot of code.
Can imagine, yeah.
So deployment, the deployment pipeline is around 1,000 lines of code. As you can see here, but we managed to boil down and carve out what is kind of the best default values needed for the different team. So when the team is going to set up a pipeline for themselves, example, we have the payment team. So the payment team have a pipelines payment YAML, which describes where they're describing all their own pipelines. And in this case, as you can see, if you take away kind of the needed lines here, like properties and whatnot, it's 4 parameters to get a pipeline up and running. It's the repository name, what repository are you sourcing from. It's the pipeline name. It's the template in your repository. So in the repository, you have a template directory called web, and there is a website YAML, and that is the one that is kind of governing or being deployed here. And you have the owner team, which is payment.
That is then plain CloudFormation, the template?
That website YAML is CloudFormation.
Okay, got it.
So that is kind of the resources being deployed. So in this case, we have not said anything about build spec because that is default. So we're just saying if you're using source build spec, we're picking that up. You can add that if you like, but we're trying to keep it with as little friction as possible. So by doing that, we're using nested stacks, and you have some limits there as well. So we had to be smart on how we kind of nesting stacks here to avoid an explosion there as well. So the team is basically saying we're going to do a deployment duplicate here, which is the deployment pipeline, and these are the parameters. So it's quick and easy to get this going for the team, and they can tweak it themselves, so we don't have to interfere with that. And even people who are unfamiliar with AWS and CloudFormation is able to do this as long as you're kind of used to use a computer. And you can do it in whatever editor you like as well.
Yeah.
So this one actually then creates two CICD pipelines, because we have one for the development branch and we have one for the release branch. So we don't have to ask for that. That's kind of the default.
Okay.
So we're getting a pipeline called payment order web workload dev and a pipeline called payment order web workload release automatically. And both of them are deploying the website YAML thing with the build spec. So that's the setup.
And now the parameter for adding that feature pipeline would be another one that is now not in here, right? So that's what I understood earlier.
Yeah, I'm not showing it here, but basically what you're adding there is feature repository name. And if you have that as an input, if it's not blank, then we're just adding that pipeline automatically.
Cool.
And if you know CloudFormation, if feature repository name is not blank, then you have a condition saying that you should add it.
Yeah.
So it's not very hard. You just have to be structured in that. So that's basically what you're setting up here. As you can see, you're getting two pipelines, so not kind of special with this one. Using version 2, as you can see, CodePipeline comes in two versions, version 1, version 2. We're defaulting on version 2 and the superseded mode and not the queue mode for most builds. So that's kind of just default setting, but you can override it if you like. So the payment order web workload creates the dev pipeline, deploys to dev, as we've said, and the payment order web workload release deploys into here, into stage. And when we're doing that, the default is also to have a manual approval in stage and prod. If you like, you can turn it off, but that's kind of an informed decision for the team to do that. So they decide not to have the manual approval if they like. Okay. There is also a small thing down in the corner here, down here, which you might see called view change. And that is a Lambda function which actually extracts the change set from CloudFormation. So we're able to see the change set inside the CICD account instead of switching account into the stage account to be able to see the change set. When you're sitting in the CICD account and watching your pipeline and you're saying, okay, I have a manual approval, I want to see the change set.
Yeah.
If you would have to go into the stage account to see it.
Yeah.
But we created a Lambda function just calling CloudFormation on the other end, reading the change set and writing that into CloudFormation logs. And then if you're clicking on that AWS Lambda, you're taking to that log in CloudWatch, and then you can see it. So that's one of the kind of things we added based on feedback.
Yeah, it makes it a little bit simpler to access the log files.
Yeah. And since we have one template here, when we added that feature, it was available to everyone automatically.
Yeah, cool.
So basically, if we're talking customization, this is an example of all the customizations you can do with a pipeline. So for everything related to build, you can have a build spec file. you can say that the runtime for the build state should be Corretto 21. You should say that it should be built in an EC2 container, but you can also use Lambda functions for doing the builds, which is quicker and cheaper. Privilege mode, true, false, depending on what you're building. You can have different parameters and so on and so forth. So lots of things we have defaulted here to avoid confusing people.
Mm-hmm.
Same with branches, so develop branch, release branch, if you want to override that. We can also trigger on release tags instead of just every commit into the release branch, if you like. That was also a request. And also AWS now supports the monorepo style, so you can also have kind of trigger path include. So you can say that all only commits into web/star will trigger a build. And these features were not in code build earlier, but they were released not long ago, and then we just could add them to all the teams in one go, since we have all the pipelines managed centrally. If all the teams are managing all their own pipelines, it would take 2, 3, 4 years before it was adopted, I guess.
Yeah.
Also, other settings, manual approvals, as we talked about, auto-approve change set. So if the change set is empty, we can auto-approve it or not, as I said, with the Lambda function. We can send notifications to a topic. So if you want notification in Slack or whatever, you can also add that one. So this is just a small set of all the different things we can tweak here.
Okay.
So default settings, 4 lines. Easy to get going, and that was kind of the intention here, to make it easy for all these people writing .NET or Java code and completely unfamiliar with AWS. And it worked pretty well, I will say.
Cool.
So this is the payment team and the definition for the workload. So the pipelines payment YAML defines all the pipelines for the payment team. So in pipelines payment, there is a long list of pipelines they have defined themselves. But for the listener here now who is used to CloudFormation, we have pipelines payment YAML, and that need to be run and deployed.
Yeah.
So we need something to orchestrate that, because we don't want to deploy all of these things manually.
Of course.
So we have a CloudFormation template called Pipelines YAML, and inside that one, we have a substack called Pipelines Payment. So it's a nested stack. So we have a kind of a master pipeline, which defines all the different teams. So it's, let's say we have 25 teams. We have 25 pipelines defined in Pipelines YAML.
Yeah.
And of course, that is another pipeline.
That's it's on top of the other ones. Yeah.
That's on top of the other one. So we have the payment pipeline deploying all the payment pipelines.
That means in the pipelines payment that we see over here, now we would have multiple different code pipelines defined that once again point at the YAML file.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, got it. Yeah, cool.
And then we have a lot of teams. So we have 25, 30-ish teams with all the different pipelines they define. So we need a way to deploy them as well in a uniform way. So guess what? Another pipeline on the top. So that's the pipeline.
The pipeline of pipelines. Now, what is interesting here is the ownership of these pipelines. Maybe we can talk a little bit about that, right? So I guess the pipeline would be owned by the platform team.
Yeah.
That means if something breaks there, then the platform team is the one that needs to actually get involved and fix that.
Correct.
What about the team pipelines? Is that also part of the platform team's responsibility?
No. When the team is adding a new pipeline, typically, so when payment team is adding a new pipeline here, this one will break. So if they're doing something wrong, this one will break on the deploy, because let's say they have configured something wrong. So this one is failing, wrong parameter, wrong whatever. That's the responsibility of the payment team to fix that.
Okay.
But of course, we will help them do it, because it might block other deployments here depending on how it's done, but it's extremely seldom that is breaking. what is normally not working is that they're able to get the pipelines up and running, but the pipelines is not working because the repository name is wrong or incorrect parameters when they're doing the builds and things like that. So that is very seldom that some of these pipelines are breaking because you're adding new pipelines because it's so few parameters that you're putting in.
Yeah.
But again, we have pipeline. And as we talked about initially, honest, we're not doing anything in the console. Not doing anything at all. So pipeline can actually update itself. So the pipeline, the master of the top here, the parent of all the pipelines, are defined itself in pipelines YAML, and it updates itself.
Mm-hmm.
And it updates itself, and it also rolls out all the templates for the other pipelines to use. Because if you're doing a change to one account YAML, it needs to be rolled out, and all the pipelines need to be updated. So it ripples off. Pipeline starts up, and then the other starts up, and so on and so forth down the line. And that's where things sometimes break, because, of course, we in the platform team, we're, in this case, working on trunk. So we're just doing updates, doing some tests and committing, and then pipeline breaks. But even if the pipeline breaks, the pipelines doesn't stop working. So it doesn't affect the teams. It's just that they can't create a new pipeline at that point in time, and normally we fix that in 10 to 15 minutes.
Okay, makes sense.
What we don't have is a pipeline controlling the 3 different accounts. This pipeline is this hierarchy is in one account, so it's in one CICD account. But I could, of course, add another level on top of this one as well to do it. But right now, it doesn't add a lot of benefits to do it for us right now, but we could do it.
That means the accounts are set up manually at the end.
So we have the 3 different accounts, and what we need to do when we're setting up a CICD account is just to get the pipeline going. So there is one manual thing to get the pipeline going the first time, and then everything is automated.
Okay, makes sense.
But that was in 2019, so we haven't done it since then.
Cool.
I've done that with other customers, and it's kind of getting AWS organizations up and running, getting the roles out there, and then just pushing it. More questions to this?
No, I think I understood that.
So this is what we have. We have 3 CICD accounts, so we have 3 kind of these structures. Many teams, many pipelines, many accounts through this. So what we have achieved now is we've reduced the complexity for developers, I think. It's 5 lines of code per pipeline. All the patches are done by platform team. So when you have new runtimes, when you have new things coming from AWS, we're fixing that in our templates. It's easy to move between the teams because we have the same pipeline all over, and it's the same way of defining pipelines from a team perspective. And it's also easy for us to add a new team into our AWS platform. So if we have a new business domain, a new team, it takes us less than an hour to add everything in, access included.
Yep, makes sense.
It's quick to change the pipelines. We have less than 10 templates we need to update. We moved from code commit to Bitbucket without kind of people noticing that, except that they were committing to another place. CodePipeline version 1, version 2, code build with Lambda runtimes was added easy. We were updating the runtimes environment kind of for Java, Python, kind of what base container you're using when you're doing builds. Adding a lot of more environment accounts to deploy into. And then we also added macOS as a build stage now in August, because suddenly AWS supported macOS in code build. And basically for us, it was just adding a parameter, and people could actually build on the Mac if needed. And that's typically for iOS applications.
Makes sense. I think what I'm concerned about is breaking changes. I guess you don't have breaking changes.
No, we don't do breaking changes.
Okay. And it never happened that you needed to do any breaking changes.
We managed to avoid it, actually.
Okay.
It might be that we did some breaking changes in the first year because we hadn't learned all the tricks and what to do. But right now, we're only doing changes that is compatible backwards, forwards, using defaults and things like that. And of course, we also have access to all the pipeline definitions, so we know what features people are using. So
yeah. My next question would have been, does that mean that you then also discontinue features if they're not being used anymore? So do you monitor the usage of the features that you have in your pipelines?
Sure, we're discontinuing what we're not using, and typically what we're discontinuing is, of course, build runtimes. Kind of typically you have .NET 6, .NET 8. If we're seeing that no one is using .NET 6, we're removing that as a valid build runtime. And the platform team is looking into that maybe once a quarter. And it's easy to do it with just basically grepping through the files.
Cool.
Nothing more advanced. So typically, again, the Mac build. This is, you asked about how we're controlling it. This is the mappings in the CloudFormation file with the, are we building with container, are we building with Lambda, are we building Ubuntu.NET, whatever, and what kind of environment do we have. So very basically, we just added macOS to this mapping, and then we could go building on Mac.
Quick question on that one. Does this automatically set up the macOS reserved instance for you, or do you need to pre-configure that somewhere? Because so I very much was looking forward to get the possibility to do macOS builds, but I'm very disappointed in the way that AWS has been making that available, because you need to pre-reserve a macOS EC2 instance to be able to actually use and consume that. Now, correct. I haven't tried it. Is this integrated within CodeBuild, so it automatically does the registration, or do you need to have a separate step?
No, it's not integrated. In CodePipeline, CodeBuild, you have something called reserved fleet. So you can reserve a fleet, and you have to reserve a Mac instance there. So that's the thing we had to do. But before we added Mac here, we had also reserved Macs because we were using Mac servers with Jenkins.
Okay, but now I think what I would want to do here would then be that I need to somehow get the pipeline to understand, do I have a reserved fleet? If not, it needs to automatically set it up. And then ideally, it would kind of free it up again after the 23 hours and 59 minutes, because that's the minimum base fee that I pay. I assume that would be a great feature add, either for your stuff or for CodePipeline.
I guess it could be achieved in our setup fairly easy, since we control all the things here. One thing to say is that there is an advantage of having that Mac up and running as well. So you have it reserved, and you can get some benefits on pricing on that. It's the same for EC2s as well. If you're doing a lot of builds, it might be cheaper to reserve them.
Yeah, that makes sense. How often do you use that Mac build? So that's
for our case, it's used daily.
Okay, well then it makes sense.
But for some cases, it could be that you want to throw it away. But also when it's yours, you're also saving time on builds because you can actually do installs on that Mac. So we can install the tooling we need, which AWS haven't added. And as long as we have it, then we have the tooling there until it's we are upgrading the base image. So that's in the build spec. But I agree with you that using Mac on AWS is kind of tricky because of the licensing model. They're claiming it's because of that, but it's the way it is. So yeah, we had to add the fleet, but that was kind of some lines of CloudFormation code we did on the platform side. And then we just added this to the pipeline, and it was kind of good to go. It was the same with, we also have the same if you want to build on ARM or Intel. So that's also just was easily added here as well. So it was just an example for how easy it is to add it.
Cool. Yeah, makes sense.
So new features, lots of features been added as well, as I said, and we're using Lambda for automatic approval, CloudFormation change set, and different things like that, which is fairly quickly for us to add. It's basically about writing the Lambda function and pushing it there. So we have a pattern for doing that as well. And we also have achieved least privilege for each team. So we have automatic rollout of all the CICD policies for each team and for each pipeline type. We could have separate roles for each pipeline, and for some pipelines we have a separate role to be sure it doesn't do any nasty things, for typically IAM for the whole thing. But again, it's also automated in the same structured way with nested stacks and parameters and whatnot. So when we're starting using a new service, we can add that to one policy file and it ripples down to wherever needed. So one thing is managing the pipeline in this way, but this helped us see how we could deal with IAM with the same thinking, with policies, and when using SSO through all the accounts as well. So I'm spending very little time on maintaining the pipelines and also very little time maintaining the entire SSO policy setup for giving people access and the pipelines access. So last slide but one, and I added some more things here compared to what you saw last time. What we learned here, since we're kind of discussing, it's easier to spend some minutes on that. It's keeping it to less than 10 pipeline types is needed to be able to maintain this. Otherwise it will be complex and it just grows into mutations, which is maybe the same thing, but it tends just to float all over the table. And also what we're seeing, that to see the similarities and agree on a way to do things is important, because you have, in one team, you have 3 ways they want to do it, of course. Yep. So agree in a team and agree across the team and saying, okay, we start out with this one and see how it works, and then we can tweak it, but everyone is on the same page and we're doing it the same way. Naming standard is key. You need to do the naming standard, and that is especially for the policies, because we're relying heavily on tags and namings on access. Separate roles per pipeline is overkill. We started with very fine granular access, but we're now boiled it down to the business domains and kind of, are you deploying applications, are you deploying data? And we have standard templates for that, which I think is approximately dealing with 80% of the things. Helpers with Lambda is very good to have in the pipelines. And back to your question, breaking changes. We're always backward compatible when updating the pipelines. So we're adding new features. If it's a feature that is not dangerous and we see that this is something everyone should have, we're just adding it. And if it's a feature that is kind of breaking things the way it is today, it's optional. And we're saying, doing like AWS is saying, okay, we've added this feature. It will be mandatory in 6 months. And then it takes 9, because after 6 months, you still have 2 teams that haven't switched or updated, and you have to kind of nag them and tell them to do it.
Yep. That's the normal process in organizations.
Yes. But it's easier to do it one place than to have it in 450 templates.
True, yeah.
And next steps, macOS native build was on that list. It's done. Working on status back to Bitbucket, as I said, we've started on that, but also doing that in a way so we can get the build and test and scanning into the pull request so it can be automatically approved as well as manual approval or whatever you needed, but you can use so we're working more on that integration and how we want to have it. Of course, more advanced testing and code quality and things like that. And that's kind of the hard part, is how much do you want to leave to the team and what should you enforce and how can you enforce it, especially when you have a lot of different languages. So
yeah, that's difficult. Yeah. And I think that's a problem that you cannot really solve for the teams. It depends what level of autonomy do you give them at the end, right? So when we talked about the pipeline at the beginning, we said like there's the build step that also covers the tests. Now you don't have insights into what happens over there, right? So do you have a place where you then actually enable integration tests, so where people can kind of after the deployment perform some automated tests, because we didn't really see that in the pipeline?
No, I haven't. We haven't added that to this example, and it varies a bit on the different team here on how they're doing it. So in some cases, we have some workarounds for that as well.
Okay, makes sense.
And also to the Mac thing, you talked about kind of stopping it out after 23 hours and 59 minutes. Automated cost optimization and build optimization is something I would like to look into, because one thing is the Mac, which is expensive. Another thing is there is a lot of pipelines, there is a lot of build steps. You have container doing just validation of CloudFormation, and you have containers building huge Java applications. So there is a way you can actually automatically optimize this for the pipelines, because you have all the metrics in code build.
Yeah.
But basically, so we are in a next steps is we are in a stable state. So it's very much based on feedbacks and based on needs now, because there are kind of no large things we have to do, because this just works and it's stable and it just works all the time. So that's where we are. Just one more thing. Automation works. Do not do ClickUps. We both agree on that.
Yes, we have to. And I think that's one of the main things that people need to start to understand, right? The moment that you do a manual change, you get into problems. So the moment that you change something manually. And I don't know, I just recently had a learning experience over there. I've been working with a team and I've been trying to tell them don't do anything manually. And then they told me, well, we are done. And what I did is I destroyed the infrastructure. And it took us 2.5 weeks to bring it up again, because it was not all automated. And that's a learning experience, I think, that maybe everyone needs to make. Okay, good. So I think this was a great and amazing session. And as I had warned you, we're not going to take the 40 minutes that we had planned, Anders. That's the normal stuff. If I do recordings, I always have so much stupid questions, right? And that encourages also to have better conversations, right? So if you want to kind of do a brief wrap up, if people want to build something similar, how would you ask them to start?
So if you want to start on this, as I said, we found a good pattern in a blog post. We found a pipeline setup that worked for us. And we saw that this can probably scale. What you need is, of course, the basic things like knowledge and whatnot. And as you said, no ClickUps at all. So start off, and I think it's important if you're a developer, you're used to writing clean code, you're used to thinking on structuring the codes, you're used to writing functions, you're used to thinking, are things recursive or not? Do I have some patterns? Do I have some standards? And sometimes developers tend to forget that when it comes to setting up pipelines, when it comes to setting up infrastructure, when it comes to doing things. So kind of it's all the same. You just have to be very structured and think in a structured way. And it's kind of what we've done here. It's for the pipelines, but it could as well has been whatever application you're building for doing something, I think.
Yep, makes sense. And I think there has been also a lot of thought process into building these things up, right? So that's stuff that people sometimes forget. They just get into having a pipeline, but if you want to scale something across multiple teams, you really need to think through how you want to do that, right?
And the pain was, of course, we had the pipelines initially just to deploy some applications, and then we needed the pipeline of pipelines because we couldn't deal with the pipelines separate. And then we started with the templating, so it has been kind of a journey, of course, for the people involved. And what is important here is always feedback, the feedback loop with people thinking what is good, what is bad, what's not working, what is working. But we focused a lot on not going into the trap of giving this thing lower priority, because that's the easy thing to do when you're working with building application, is that you're not focusing on the tooling, you're not focusing on the infrastructure, things like that. And
it's true.
People like you and me who has been doing this for a long time know that it bites you in the end. And I want to be able to take the vacation off and take the summer off without. I was away for decoupled from this project 6 weeks in the summer. I don't think people noticed because it just works.
Great. Yeah, that's what we need to build to. That's correct. And I think the importance of having, I always say, the boring stuff just up and running and empowering teams to be successful at the end, right? That's the stuff that just some development teams assume to be there and to be available. We underestimate the impact that this has.
Yeah. And also
Anders,
the quality of what you're delivering as well, because when you're doing it this way, you as I'm saying, when you're automating, if you're doing things manually, you're doing things wrong now and then. If you're automating things, you're either doing it wrong or right. And if you're doing it wrong, you're doing it wrong in all the places you're doing it, but you can also fix it. And then it's fixed. You're not repeating the same mistakes, the same errors, and things like that. So it's AWS also have this mantra of every year in, I don't remember what it was, infrastructure parts, they're saying that what is manual or what is bad processes should be improved. So they're improving kind of 80% year over year of what is remaining to keep the quality up. So it's always room for improvement. It's getting harder and harder, but I think it's important to focus on it.
That is true. Anders, where can people find more about you or maybe ask you some questions? What is your preferred contact method? Is it email or socials?
I have email, and I'm also on LinkedIn, so you can find me there. Might be the best ways to do it, and we can take it from there. I think the other social medias are kind of floating all around now, so I prefer those two. And I will send you the link to the LinkedIn page, or you can just search me up there as well.
Well, I know the LinkedIn page. I don't need to search it, but I'll add it to the show notes so people that don't know where to find you can reach out to you there. Anders, thank you so much. This has been great insights. I hope that everyone learned some stuff from this, gained some ideas on how to optimize their CI/CD pipeline setup. And looking forward for more conversations around this topic. So please bring them into the comments over here if you have questions, or reach out to Anders directly. And with that, thanks a lot, Anders, for your time, for preparing this, and for sharing your experiences with us.
Thanks for having me, Johannes. It's always a pleasure, and hopefully I can come back another time with more war stories.
Definitely. Bye-bye.
Bye.